Well, welcome everyone. Thank you for joining today's webinar, Strengthening Data Governance Through Effective Stewardship. I am Ashley Howell, and I'm pleased to be the moderator on today's webcast. I'd love to start by introducing you to today's presenters, a few logistics as well. We are going to be recording the presentation and be making this available for you at the conclusion of the webinar. We also have got a feedback survey and would love to gather that at the conclusion of this webinar. I'm going to introduce you to today's webinars, and then we really encourage you guys to ask questions throughout the presentation, and we'll be pausing for those. We'd love to make this as interactive as possible. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce you to Paul. Paul's got over 20 years of experience and was previously the Chief Enterprise Information Architect at NI, which is now Emerson. His passion lies in transforming data into actionable insights that advance an organization's mission. Mike is also here with us. He's founder and principal architect at infoVia, and he draws from a quarter century of software, data, and security experience at global leaders in healthcare, manufacturing, insurance, education, and service industries. And he's now thought of as a thought leader and a senior consultant with infoVia. Thanks so much for being here today, Mike.
Thank you. And, I'm really excited to have Paul here as our guest of honor. Paul and I met about a decade ago at a conference. We were both speaking, and I've always respected his work. Recently, we've become, I would call us close friends, and I really appreciate Paul's insights. Everybody talks about doing data, specifically data governance. Paul walks the walk. He has done this successfully at prior organizations, and his speech this year at WWDC was, I think, the best one of the whole conference. So he's always learning, and so always adding to it. And so I've asked him to join us today, and I'm honored to have him. Over to you, Paul.
Well, thank you so much, Mike, and it's an honor to be here. Thank you for inviting me, and I hope for all of you who are on the webinar, you get something good out of this. So I'd like to set the context first with a bit of an older study, but this is one of my favorites. Bain and Company did 10 years of research across more than 1,000 companies, and they found a clear correlation between decision effectiveness and business performance. And that seems pretty obvious, right? We know a good decision when we see it, but how does one measure effectiveness of decisions? Right? How do we quantify that numerically? And the researchers, they found 4 aspects of decision-making capability that were highly correlated to decision effectiveness. And those were quality, speed, yield, and effort. And they further reported that for the companies that aren't effective at making decisions, those low-performing companies represented by the dark gray bars in the charts, it isn't just financial results that suffer. So read the rest of that quote. Organizations that can't decide and deliver are dispiriting to their employees. Work becomes like a depressing Dilbert comic strip. Have any of you on this webinar experienced poor decision-making at your organization? The ability, what?
Yeah. Don't make them show hands.
yeah. Don't answer specifically in the chat. The ability to make high quality decisions at scale quickly and with low effort, and then execute those decisions as intended, that is an extremely powerful competitive advantage, both in terms of financial performance and our employees' quality of life at work. Organizations that make and execute decisions more effectively than their competitors outperform their competitors. Now, not everybody cares about data. Those of you who are on this webinar, you likely do care about data, but you've likely experienced people who don't get excited about data. And if you start talking data governance with them, their eyes glaze over, right? But all business stakeholders, executives, investors, employees, and their families, customers, partners, and communities all care about the effectiveness of our business decisions, at least to some degree. And if not, they probably won't consider themselves to be stakeholders much longer. Now, we both admire Bill Inman, Mike, right? He's the father of the data warehouse, and he continues to contribute to the state of the art today. Right? Bill defined the data warehouse in his book from 1992, right? In the 1900s, as my daughters would remind me. He revised the definition slightly at the Annual Data Vault Consortium in 2018, which, Mike, I know you were at.
Yeah, I had the honor of being there and meeting Bill at that time. We've become friends since, but what I honor Bill for is that his definition has been largely unchanged
Yeah.
for 40 years, and yet it's still relevant today.
I'll come back to that specifically. But here I want to point out that the primary purpose is, and it always has been, better decision making. And like you said, it's a brilliant definition that still holds up. I expect this definition of the data warehouse will continue to be relevant, for as long as business leaders continue making decisions, right? Which I hope is a long time. And that's because data, when managed effectively and transformed into pertinent business information, data moves the needle on all four of those components of effective decision making: quality, speed, yield, and effort, right? Having trustworthy, pertinent information increases the quality and the speed of our decisions. Good information makes decisions simpler, easy to make, sometimes even obvious. And then also, our organizations are more likely to execute on those decisions as intended, right? Because we have confidence executing well-informed decisions. And in a more recent study, Bark reported that 76% of business leaders indicate their company is striving to create a data culture. But even more, 83% want their business to be data-driven. Now, this tells me that most business leaders understand this correlation to business performance. However, just 35% said their company was even partially data-driven in their decision-making, and even fewer, just 33%, are comfortable questioning KPIs and metrics in their organization. Now, that indicates to me that while leaders desire to be data-driven, desire more correct decisions, faster decisions, easier decisions, more often execute upon the decisions made, the reality is that we're not yet where we desire to be. And I believe that data governance. Oh, yeah, go ahead, Mike.
Yeah, that difference between 83 and 33, 50% of us are fooling ourselves.
That's
We're saying,
right.
or at least admitting we want to be, but we're not walking the walk. So you're one that talks the talk and walks the walk. So that's why I appreciate your insights today.
Cool. Well, I believe that data governance is a key component to achieving this desire to be data-driven, the desire for better decision-making, the desire for business performance. And Mike, before the webinar, you were telling me that you think that our employees, not just our decision makers, but everyone in the organization benefits from having access to the data, right?
Well, I think that should be true. I will say that much. We would hope that not only our executive have access to our data, and now with the proliferation of AI and these large language models and people using ChatGPT in the marketplace, it's helping with the speed aspect of this graph, right? We're becoming faster, and maybe even with less effort producing more results, but the quality of those, I think, is very questionable. And so hence the need for better data governance, because it's not only about governing the data that the executives use, it's really all the data for all the people all the time.
Yeah. Let's talk about data governance a bit.
Sounds good.
Yeah. So I think before we talk about data governance, we have to start with an understanding of exactly what it is that we're wanting to govern, right? And Investopedia defines an asset with this definition here. And first thing I'll point out is an asset is a resource with economic value. Now, that's not to say that valuation or measuring value isn't hard, right? Ask anyone who's tried to value a company before investing in their stock. Valuation can be difficult, and often valuation produces an imprecise result. That's okay, but assets do have economic value, even if that value is difficult to quantify. Also, with an asset, there is an expectation of a future benefit. If I buy a mutual fund in my retirement account, I expect it to grow and keep me fed in retirement. But the future benefit of an asset isn't always an economic benefit, right? If I buy a car, I expect it to get me from one place to another. If I buy a couch, I expect it to hold me up comfortably as I sit on it. And Mike, in my opinion, there is no confusion on this whatsoever. Data are assets, and we must treat them as such. If we don't, we risk losing those assets, wasting the real dollars we've spent collecting them. Now, Mike, as a former infoVia customer, I've heard a phrase from you when it comes to handling data as assets.
Well, yeah, Paul, like you and many of our customers and clients, when we pull all the data together in one place, when we integrate it, we build a very powerful asset, something that needs to be utilized. We need ROI to come out of that, but we also need to control who sees what. So access control is central, and that's a subset of governance. As we say at infoVia, share your data widely, but protect it fiercely. And of course, that's why we invented InfoSecure.
There you go. There you go. So other important words in this definition are owns or controls. If no one owns or controls the resource, is it even still an asset, right? And how exactly do we control data, right? Some people think that data are just uncontrollable waste byproducts of our operational processes, right? Treating data not as assets, but as uncontrollable waste byproducts, not recognizing the economic value of these resources or their potential future benefits, I believe is one reason why Zhamak Dehghani's recent writing on data mesh has been resonating with so many people. Specifically, her data mesh principle of data as a product. But are data assets or products? So Mike, you recently spoke at a webinar on how to create hit data products. Can we talk for a little bit about whether data are assets or products?
Well, the data products are making it easier to leverage the data in high leverage situations. So those products are the software solutions that use data, I would say, as the raw material and produce a finished good that is a product based on that data.
Yeah, I love it. I love it. So I've got an opinion that data are not products, at least not automatically, right? Data are always assets because they meet all the criteria of assets. Now, could we shape that asset into a product that we monetize? Potentially, yes. And should we apply product thinking, design thinking to our data? Absolutely, yes. Right. This is the idea behind Dehghani's data as a product principle, right? Applying design thinking to data. And there's another application of the term product. You might ask, don't we need an agile software product team to do that work related to data? Yes, we do. And here, I think the trap we fall into is incorrectly equating identity and output, right? We do this all the time as human beings. We judge people based on what value they bring us as opposed to who they are, right? We meet someone new and we ask them, so what do you do, right? I, Paul, am an information architect.
They'll only show up here if they've accepted.
Mike, you're not muted. But anyway, I'm an information architect, but that's not really my identity, right? My identity is me, Paul Hooper. And beauty may be in the eye of the beholder, but identity is defined by the creator, right? The work I do, the output that I produce, that isn't my identity. My output isn't my identity. And we make the same mistake with a software product, right? Which performs the task of automated data transformation. An agile product team, having a product owner following an agile methodology, develops a software product. That team doesn't develop or create the data, but still we can confuse the output for the identity, right? The output of that software product is data. But that doesn't mean that data is a product, not automatically. The data are assets, both in raw form and in transformed form. Data are assets. The software transforming the data is a product in agile software development terms. That's what we develop. It's the software product, which is engineered, designed, built, creatively implemented. We don't create the data. Creatively implemented data is called fiction, right? It's made up. The work of politicians
come from the semiconductor manufacturing
yes.
industry, and where we took raw materials and we enhanced them significantly into a product that could then and has application in, all sorts of devices. So I think the assets being the data, those raw materials produced through this agile and product thinking process produces our data products that then can be used in other applications for insights
Yeah.
and all the.
Yeah, I would say that data assets can be products if we actively apply a data monetization strategy to those curated data assets, but it does take additional work. In Zhamak Dehghani's work on data mesh, the software products that transform the data from one type of data asset to another type of data asset, that arrow in the picture, those software products are what Zhamak is talking about domain-oriented teams being responsible for. And I'll get more into that a bit later. But these teams are analogous to agile product teams, having roles like product owner, right? But Zhamak means something different by her principle of data as a product, right? The result of doing that development well within an enterprise are intentionally produced, shared, and trusted enterprise information assets, right? And doing that well requires that we apply product design thinking, right? Considering the desirability, the viability, the feasibility of the output, the entire user experience of utilizing those assets for that future benefit. And that's what Zhamak means by data as a product. And doing that well requires data governance. So Merriam-Webster defines governance with this. The keywords here are overseeing the control and direction of something, right? Overseeing implies that governance isn't exerting direct control, but overseeing the control. Direction implies that we have a desired outcome, and depending on our actions, there's a wrong way and a right way it can go. And there's that word control again, right? Someone must control something if we expect to set the direction. And with data governance, we're simply overseeing the control and direction of data, right? I'm really fond of how Bob Seiner says the data won't govern itself. We as people who care about desirable business outcomes, we must govern our data if we expect to achieve those outcomes, because our data isn't going to do that by itself. And when we talk about data governance, the most common role discussed is data stewardship. And Merriam-Webster's definition of stewardship talks about conducting and supervising and managing. It emphasizes that the word stewardship is especially applicable when one doesn't own the something, right? But rather it's been entrusted to one's care to be carefully and responsibly managed. So there's a formalized responsibility and accountability implied by the word stewardship, and that applies to data stewardship. Data stewardship is a formalized responsibility and accountability for data. And data stewardship is a responsibility that can be given to an individual, especially if that stewardship is over a particular subset of data, a particular type of data that the individual understands well. But who owns the data? Right? Stewardship is distinct from ownership. Now, some people say that in addition to data stewardship, an important data governance role is data ownership. Now, the implication there is usually that the person performing the role is at a higher position in the company, a senior business leader, perhaps. But I've always struggled with the terminology data ownership when used to describe a data governance role. And here's why. I met Doug Laney back when he was a Gartner analyst, and he was writing what I consider to be one of the most influential books on me when it comes to data, and that's Infonomics. And in that book, Doug lays out 8 principles that I've embraced for years. I've found all 8 to be very powerful in articulating a data strategy. But one of those is this ownership principle, which states that by default, information assets belong to the organization, not any application department or individual. And this is why I struggle to get behind a data governance role being labeled data ownership. And that's not to say that departments or individuals don't have responsibility when it comes to data governance. We absolutely do. We optimize the value of data by dividing up those responsibilities and assigning those to various people responsibly. That's very important, but it's not data ownership. typically when I hear people talk about data ownership in the context of data governance, I found that they're usually trying to communicate that higher degree of accountability, or even accountability for business outcomes related to certain data. They don't usually mean the data belongs to, but belongs to is what the word ownership means. If I say I own this car, I don't mean that I'm responsible for it. I mean that it's mine, right? It belongs to me. I own it. And that's what ownership is really about. It's about belongs to, who owns the asset, the information. And that is by default, the organization. Individuals do not own the data, the organization does. And I do believe there's an important exception to this, right? Which is personal information, right? We've made great strides in this with GDPR and that sort of thing. GDPR defines PI as information related to an identified or identifiable natural person, right? So think social security number, biometric records, that sort of thing. I believe that individuals do own that data, along with some other examples, and organizations that collect PI may exhibit control over the data without ownership of the data, right? So they're still assets, but it's a distinction of ownership and control. Mike, you were about to say something, I think.
Well, I was just, I was thinking about the problem of data silos and how ownership would assume that would insinuate that it's mine and therefore I control who gets to see it. Whereas if I'm stewarding it, it's not mine, it's my organization's, and it's my responsibility to make sure that we are using it to the full.
That's right. Well said. Well said.
It takes the bureaucratization out of data democratization.
Yeah. Yeah. So if I'm talking about responsibility or accountability in data governance terms, I try to avoid the word ownership, reserving ownership for when I'm talking about belongs to. So a different kind of data or different kind of ownership is domain ownership. Right. I mentioned Zhamak Dehghani earlier in her writing on data mesh and this idea of domain ownership. It's been a hot topic over the last 5 years. And at WWDVC last year, Cindy Meyerson said that Dehghani's work on data mesh has been a much needed wake up call for many of us in the data world. And I agree with that. Now, without getting too deep, I'll say that Zhamak defines data mesh as a socio-technical paradigm which is rooted in 4 principles, all of which need to be applied to be successful. But this is the first principle of domain ownership, right? This principle is not so much about ownership as it is about domains. And in the book, she references Eric Evans' work on domain-driven design, that blue book that many software engineers have on their shelf. And it's about drawing a bounded context around concepts, data objects, and as a result, segmenting or isolating data so that we can distribute responsibilities to departments and individuals who are most capable to do the work of optimizing the value of data, right? Like data governance. And why? That's so we don't fall on our face when we're trying to do this at scale and with the agility that our business demands. The implication is that if we don't, we'll struggle with both scale and speed. I believe that many of us working in data in our companies are experiencing struggles with both scale and speed. And I think that neglecting domain ownership may be, at least in part, why. And at a former organization, we were experiencing a very serious data governance struggle. We had a very important data asset. Many people across the organization were using it. And we tried to identify data stewards and data owners for those tables, people who would govern this highly valuable data, but those people refused. Even when they were doing the work already, just being recognized for that work they were doing wasn't desirable. And these were ambitious people willing to work, but they only had expertise specific to their domain. Their job responsibilities were specific to a domain. So one set of 4 tables had data from 11 different domains, all jammed together, right? We failed to follow the principle of isolation. People were not willing to govern data spanning domains that weren't their domain. Now, these tables each had data spanning multiple domains, right, at the table level. So think about how difficult it would be to maintain governance processes, keeping track of people entering and exiting roles and responsibilities at the individual column level. right? At the schema level, sure, but because we couldn't distribute data governance responsibilities at even the table level, we were really set up for data governance failure. This principle of domain ownership is about distributing responsibilities for data and achieving agility. But Mike, this isn't a new challenge, right? This isn't just surfacing in 2024, is it? This has been something we've dealt with for a long time, right?
That's true, but I like how you're distinguishing between owning the domain, the expertise around the data, without owning the actual data itself. The data is to be shared. My job as a domain owner would be to simply steward that data and make it safe and readily available to be shared.
Well said. Yeah. So
Um,
going back to Bill Inman's definition, right, of a data warehouse.
Paul, sorry to pause you, but we did have a good question come in about
Oh,
Bill.
okay, great.
Yes, speaking of Bill Inman, he's the leading voice on the topic and the rise and use of unstructured data. How does unstructured data play into a governance strategy or the other big concept, democratization of data?
Oh, fantastic question. I'm actually going to touch on that in this slide. This is just where I was going, right? So this is Bill's definition. And a data warehouse is a subject-oriented, integrated by business key, time-variant, non-volatile collection of data in support of management's decision-making process and or in support of auditability as a system of record. Now, this was in 2018, but this doesn't really deviate very much from what he originally wrote in 92. This portion here was his original definition. Now, neither now, and this is getting to the question that was asked, neither now nor then was there anything in there about structured or unstructured or semi-structured, the volume or the velocity of data or a particular technology platform that was necessary to implement this, right? And that's why this is such a brilliant definition that still holds up, right? That it doesn't matter if the data is structured, unstructured, or semi-structured. There's, this definition still applies. Now, when it comes to governance, governance is a lot harder unless you've applied at least some structure to data. Now, I believe that data, all data has structure. It's just a matter of when we define that structure, right? So unstructured data, right? You think a text document, for instance, if that data is going to have value to us, it probably needs a structure to be defined, right? Like if you think about XML or JSON, right, it might just be text, but if we infer some structure from it and we investigate that data, apply that structure, we can then do a better job governing it.
Paul, that's well put, and I appreciate that question. We should send dinner tickets to whoever submitted it because that was perfect timing. But I would say I kind of hear Bill's voice in the back of my head saying, actually, most of your data is unstructured, and that's why Bill's dedicated the recent years of his life to building a tool called DataBox that can help us to manage that unstructured data and treat it as an asset and as something that's valuable. Get that value out of it in the organization.
Yeah. So the last thing I want to do here is just emphasize this first characteristic, subject oriented, right? The idea that a data warehouse would be organized by subject, that there would be business related taxonomies governing the organization of information. This is not a new idea. This is actually the first characteristic of the data warehouse as Bill originally defined it. So the idea here is that Zermach's, focus on this is not entirely new, right? It's not entirely a new idea to be domain oriented. It's a foundational characteristic that I think some of us in data have unfortunately forgotten or ignored. But I will say that I do find the word domain is much more powerful and preferable to subject, right? So let's talk a little bit about what a domain is. Eric Evans defines a domain as a sphere of knowledge, influence, or activity, right? When Eric and Zermach talk about domains and the application and software development, there's a real focus on activity, right? And this is very powerful. because I found that when we talk in terms of subject matter areas, we tend to think about nouns, right? Because these nouns tend to have meaning and purpose across many areas of our business, those nouns don't categorize easily and intuitively. If we instead think in terms of domains, we tend to think about verbs, right? Because we're thinking about business processes. And business processes are executed by departments and individuals in our organizations. Now, domains are not teams, right? I'll say it again, domains are not teams, but there is an intuitive alignment when we start to think about responsibilities. And as we execute business processes, these activities, they originate new data. And we, like when we receive a new order, right? We might get a new order number. We might know descriptive details about that order, like who placed the order and when the order was placed and what products were ordered. The people who are closest to that data are those people who are executing those business processes. And those business processes can be classified by domain very intuitively, and thus into a domain taxonomy. And it's this idea of leveraging a domain taxonomy that has really lit a fire inside of me lately. And this idea was central to the keynote that I gave at the Data Vault conference this year. And also the Data Vault system, it aligns very well with this way of thinking about data. So let's give all the people who turned into this webinar some actionable advice, right? Some things they can do to achieve more effective data governance. First, let's establish a clear definition of data governance in our organizations, right? We need to start with why, right? Link data governance objectives to our data strategy, which in turn should link to our business strategy, right? We need to understand the why of data governance. Now, I define data governance as the execution and enforcement of authority over the management of data so that the value of data is optimized and as desired business outcomes are achieved. Now, this definition falls apart without the assumption that data are assets of the organization worthy of being secured and managed as highly valuable assets. Information assets are very special kinds of assets, though, because they are non-depleting and non-exclusive. Now, non-depleting means that we can use data for a particular purpose and we haven't depleted it. It's not gone. We haven't consumed it, right? It's unlike the cash that I have in my wallet, which if I use it, it's gone. We can use and reuse data over and over again, and it's still ours to use again. Non-exclusive means that we can use data for a variety of purposes, right? We can use data for a particular purpose, and then later we can reuse that same data for a different purpose, and it's no less valuable. And that could even be a purpose that we didn't anticipate when we originally collected the data, right? And these two characteristics of data are why accessibility is a pillar of effective data governance. Is our data easily and effectively accessible for use? If the data are not used, data has a negative valuation, right? Because data costs us something to collect and keep. But if it's not used, there's no return on investment in the form of increased profit or revenue. The more we use and reuse data, the more the potential return, right? We must keep in mind.
That comes back to the point earlier, share it widely, protect it fiercely.
There you go. And
we
protect it fiercely means the next pillar is security, right?
There you go.
Is our data secured from bad actors or misuse, right? Data breaches are costly in terms of the immediate impact and the long-term brand damage. Bad actors can utilize our data directly against us. And so we must secure our data from bad actors that would seek to inflict harm, but also we need to secure our data against misuse, right? We must train our people, document examples of appropriate and inappropriate use of data within our organization, right? So no matter how well we secure our data platform, if our user community downloads a copy of that to an Excel spreadsheet, puts it on a flash drive and drops it in the airport, right? That's going to get us into trouble. Now, Mike, I've used infoVia's InfoSecure to help share data widely and protect it fiercely. Like you said, it provides an easy to use web browser interface that I found enhances data accessibility and security. Do you want to
No.
elaborate a bit on that?
Well, Paul Gartner, to that point, and appreciate the plug there. Yeah, we invented InfoSecure because you have an asset that you want to share widely, but yet it's not appropriate for everybody to see all the data. So by masking and filtering that data at runtime with the context of who's asking, and then having a business steward manage the policies instead of IT, then the solution is a multi-use data product where that data can appropriately be consumed. It reminds me of a Gartner statistic that they released, it's probably been a year or 18 months ago, that said organizations that share their data externally are 3 times more profitable than those who don't. So the ability to share your data, not only internally, within your silo, across silos within your organization, but then outside your organization to your partners, your customers, the public. When you can do that, it takes that asset that you astutely called out there, that it doesn't cost you any more to use that data more widely. It costs you when you don't.
That's right. Opportunity cost, right?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Well, and it's got to be good data as well, right? When we share it. And so the third pillar is quality, right? Is our data trustworthy? Can we use it with confidence? And I found that most accessibility and security concerns tend to be black and white, right? Do you have access to it or not? But data quality should be measured on a more continuous scale. Now, Mike, you said you and I both have a history in semiconductor manufacturing. And when I was in semiconductor manufacturing, I heard this so many times. You can't manage what you don't measure, right? So we need to start measuring data quality. And I like to say we should make a pact, right? The data assets that we're responsible for should be pertinent, accurate, complete, and timely. And we should measure all 4 of those proactively, seek to continuously improve those measures over time.
Thanks, Paul. I wrote that down. That's certainly accurate. That's certainly actionable. Right? That's something that we can take away from this, that the PACT acronym. And I think it's also timely. It's not only does the T stand for timely, but I think your message is timely, because with the proliferation of AI and the common man using data, they're demanding more data from the data providers. They're requesting data from their schools, from their governments, from their employers, and then they're using that hopefully appropriately, but it's our responsibility to make that, as stewards of the data, to make it accessible, secure, and of high quality, so that the right decisions are being made by the right people with the right context.
That's right. And what if we don't? Right. So, Mike, before this webinar, you asked me about quantifying the cost of neglecting data governance. And the cost of not securing our data is something we've begun to understand better with all the recent data breaches that we've had. But what about the cost of inaccessible or bad quality data, right? How do we put a dollar figure on that? So here's another study for everyone on the webinar to consider here when you're thinking about the cost of not doing data governance. IBM studied companies in the US and estimated that the cost of bad data was $3.1 trillion. And that was back in 2016, right? That's an annualized figure, 3.1 trillion. Now, those of us who deal in data on a regular basis, we already know that bad data is costly, but that figure is stunning, right? 3.1 trillion.
Well, I looked it up. The US population in 2016 was 300 million, a little over 300 million. That's $10,000 per man, woman, and child in the United States annually. $10,000 annually per man, woman, and child. The cost of bad data. That's staggering. I wonder how they came up with that.
Now we want to make it actionable, right? And when we talk trillions, we tend to lose people, right? Because our brains struggle to even comprehend the magnitude of that number. Well, Harvard Business Review wrote an article citing that study from IBM which might help us bring this home a bit and apply it practically. They state that the reason bad data costs so much is that decision makers, managers, knowledge workers, data scientists, and others must accommodate bad data in their everyday work. And doing so is time consuming and expensive. So like salespeople waste time dealing with errored prospect data, right? Service delivery people waste time correcting flawed customer orders received from sales. Data scientists spend an inordinate amount of time cleansing data. IT spends enormous effort lining up systems that don't talk. And senior executives hedge their plans because they don't trust the numbers from finance, right? These can all be thought of as examples of what HBR calls hidden data factories. And the expense of these hidden data factories form the basis of IBM's $3.1 trillion figure. So those of you who are on this webinar, think about these examples and how they might apply in your organization, right? 50%. The time that knowledge workers waste in hidden data factories, hunting for data, finding and correcting errors, searching for confirmatory sources for data that they don't trust. What would your people report? Now, HBR cites another figure, 60%. The time data scientists spend cleaning and organizing data. Now, data scientists are expensive. Also, 75%. This is the time associated with hidden data factories in simple operations, right? Causing things like increased time to market, right? What is that costing us? What are your percentages? How are you communicating these hidden costs to your leaders? And more importantly, what are you doing about it, right? There's no mystery in how we reduce the costs of bad data. We shine a harsh light on those hidden data factories and reduce them as much as possible. And by doing so, we reduce the effort and the frustration our people experience dealing with bad data. Now, hopefully everyone's understanding why we need data governance. So let's talk about a few practical steps we can take to improve, and as a result, improve the accessibility, security, and quality of our data.
Paul, I'm looking forward to the practical steps. I think that's kind of what everybody came here for, and you've already given us several. But a thought just came to my mind there when you're talking about how the cost of bad data, whether it's inappropriately reported data or whether it's incorrect data, how the cost of that propagates as it goes throughout the organization or downstream.
Yes.
Kind of like it's kind of the converse of the comment we made earlier about sharing data. Once you have valid data, sharing that, there's very little cost of putting good data in the hands of those downstream. The caveat is, if it's good data, then that cost can be recouped, and that cost delivers our return on investment. If it's bad data, you probably have the opposite result. It propagates a problem. Poor decision downstream, which have these. That's how it adds up to this really staggering number.
Well said. Well, so practical steps. First thing I will say is define your domain taxonomy. I've talked about the data mesh principle of domain ownership, how that's a better idea than data ownership. I've also talked about what a domain is and how a domain taxonomy helps us classify data, but it's not enough to define the word domain. We must define the actual unique domains found in our businesses, right? And here is the bad news up front. There is not an easy button for this because every business is different. Another piece of bad news, it's important we get this right up front because it needs to stay consistent over time. We shouldn't take an agile approach to a domain taxonomy. If our physical implementations depend on our domain definitions, we'll have technical debt every time we change our domain definitions, right? So we need to do this work right up front as best we can. And we must connect with our organization's leadership on this, understands how our business truly functions. And while domains are not teams, again, domains are not teams, our organizational structure can give us clues to our domains. Just keep in mind that teams get reorganized. And when that happens, the processes those teams execute, those processes tend to stay grouped together. And there are typically common names across industries for those groupings. Now, here's a piece of good news. For an enterprise data governance program, I found a very powerful accelerator to get started on this. I was recently part of an effort where we challenged ourselves to find a decent template that we could start with, right? And that the TBM Council released version 4 of the TBM taxonomy back in 2020. The TBM, or Technology Business Management Council, you can Google that, is a nonprofit organization, and they have the goal of creating and promoting best practices for running IT as a business. And the taxonomy provides classifications that help organizations compare themselves, right? Just as businesses rely on generally accounting principles as their standard practices for financial reporting, providing comparability of financial statements between periods and different firms, the TBM taxonomy provides a generally accepted way of reporting IT costs and other metrics. But it's not the only reason why the taxonomy exists. One of the challenges the taxonomy aims to address is to align data from multiple sources, better understand how value is delivered. The taxonomy has a solution layer, which organizes application products and services that provide value to the business, right? That enable business processes, right? Activities. So when we considered organizing information by domain, the solution layer seemed like a really good place to start. And we realized this had value beyond the information ecosystem. And so that led us to an enterprise domain taxonomy, or simply enterprise domains. And from an enterprise information architecture perspective, we decided to apply that to the organizational structure of what we would physically build out in our data platform. And that physical segmentation, where domains represented by schemas, along with alignment to easily understood standard terminology, that would help us clarify data governance responsibilities, right? Because again, people don't want to govern a monolithic mess of data spanning multiple domains. But by segmenting the data by domain, people are more comfortable governing that data. Now, your organization, those of you on the webinar, you may already have a well-defined domain taxonomy, but if you don't, check out the TBM taxonomy, specifically the solution layer, right? Each one of the 6 categories of solutions breaks down into recognizable domains and subdomains like finance and workforce and sales and marketing and manufacturing and delivery. Domains exist in a taxonomy. These domains, they have subdomains and subdomains of subdomains, and we call these a taxonomy because taxonomies help us classify things, right? The Dewey Decimal System is a taxonomy. It helps us classify and organize books. The Linnaeus taxonomy helps biologists organize and classify animals. Same with an organization's domain taxonomy. An organization's domain taxonomy helps us to organize and classify data, right? And most importantly, data that originates as we execute business processes, right? We can't begin to classify data by domain until we define what our domains are. But once we do, we can segment data governance and enable data governance at scale, right? Supporting stability and supportability and clear responsibility for data assets. And after we identify our domains, we can identify domain owners, not data owners, but domain owners. And this is a lot easier than it sounds, because these domain owners, they already exist in our organization. They're already doing the work. If we've done a good job defining our domain taxonomy in a way that represents our organization and the business it performs, then this is intuitive, right? Who owns the finance domain? Start talking to the chief financial officer, right? Who owns the workforce domain? Chief people officer, right? If you've been thinking about what could I do at work to give me more visibility, that would put me in conversations with the top executives at my company, right? Leading a data governance effort should do just that, right? But don't be intimidated. These people are human beings. They put their pants on one leg at a time. And often these people are very happy to hear from someone who cares about their organization's decision-making and business performance. And they've likely been hearing complaints about the very thing you've been trying to include, or you've been trying to improve, right? So bottom line, the question of who owns a domain is much easier to answer then who is responsible for the data governance of that system or that schema, or even worse, that table, right? This is where we as data professionals get into trouble. We create a table, we fill it with important data, and then someone else complains about the poor quality, accessibility, or security of that data. And only then we ask, who is the data owner for this table? Can I get volunteers, right? No one is going to raise their hand and volunteer for that, right?
I like you
So,
differentiate here, Paul, between owning the domain versus owning the data
yeah,
itself. And
yeah.
so we're stewarding the data, and we're owning the domain. Now, point of clarification,
Yeah.
is the C-level officer the owner, or you said talk to them? Are they probably going to delegate that owner? There's probably somebody already filling that role within their organization, or is it the CFO themselves?
I would say it depends on which domain you're talking about and how you've defined your domains, right? So if you've identified finance as a domain and you ask the question, who owns finance? Then heck yes, it is your CFO. Absolutely. But if you've defined a subdomain of general accounting and reporting or revenue accounting, that might be someone who is delegated by the CFO. And I would say that data governance responsibilities probably should be delegated from the CFO to someone who works for that organization.
Okay, thanks.
After we've identified the domains and the domain owners, we can start segmenting data objects and pipelines that we build by domain. And this is where I found the data vault system to be particularly powerful, right? If you follow the modeling standards correctly, your hubs, links, your satellites, they should be easily categorized by domain. And the higher domain in the taxonomy, the more formal our data governance processes will need to be, right? With more people involved in those processes, right? For example, the customer hub likely categorizes under the business domain, while the order item link categorizes under the order management subdomain of the customer service domain. And since satellites are segmented according to sources and processes, each satellite is likely categorized under a specific subdomain as well. And so for those who don't utilize the data vault system, just remember this, right? Domain owners are unlikely to accept governance responsibilities outside of their domain expertise. And once we have the domains defined, we should segment and isolate our data objects and data pipelines by domain in an intermediate layer to enable data governance at the domain level.
So Paul, we at infoVia have implemented a lot of data vaults, and I would agree with you. It's a business-centric modeling paradigm. So it lends itself well. But I'd like to call it's not the only way to achieve this. It's just a documented and generally accepted means to
That's right.
achieve the domain specific categorization.
And my last piece of advice is to formalize the role of data stewardship, right? But don't go looking for data stewards, right? I once had a guy ask me, who is this Stewart guy? What's his last name? I can't find him in the directory. Data steward is not a job title, but rather data stewardship is a role that people who are already working for your organization should be held accountable for. So let the domain owners tell us who is responsible for the data stewardship in their domain, right? The truth is that if we have a functional business, there are already people doing this job, and they're likely upset about all the unrecognized data cleansing and wrangling work they must do on a daily basis, managing those hidden data factories, because that data team over there is not giving us what we really need, right? So Sarbanes-Oxley 302, if Mary, the CFO, is expected to act as the signing officer of our quarterly financial reports, then Mary must review the report and certify that, quote, it does not contain any untrue statement of material fact or omit to state a material fact necessary in order to make the statements made in light of the circumstances under which statements are made, not misleading, right? So should we expect that Mary cares about the accuracy of the numbers in the report that she is signing, right? More than likely, yes. And would you expect that she's put dependable people on our team, like Shirley, who are already doing the work of data stewardship on a daily basis? And more than likely, yes. So find these people who are already doing the work and partner with them to learn their pain points and improve upon the governance situation.
I'm motivated, Paul. Let's do
So
it.
to sum up, here are the takeaways that I hope you leave with, Mike. Right. First, start with why, right? Create and communicate your data governance strategy. Understand that data are assets and communicate the costs of not governing data. And then define your organization's domain taxonomy. Every organization's domain taxonomy is unique, but the TDM taxonomy might be a helpful place to start. Identify your organization's domain owners, not data owners. The organization as a whole owns the data, but domain owners. And if you've defined the taxonomy well, you'll find these people already work for your organization. And segment and isolate data objects by domain, right? Once you've identified your taxonomy and your domain owners, segment your data objects and isolate the data pipelines so that governance is feasible, right? And even desirable. And finally, formalize the role of data stewardship, not by hiring data stewards, but by recognizing domain-oriented teams and the people who are already doing the work, involve them and help them be more effective. Mike?
Super. Well, thank you again, Paul. And it's been an honor to share the stage with you again here virtually with our audience. Thanks for the questions that came in. If you are, if you want more information or need help with any of this, you can contact Paul or any of us at infoVia at the website on your screen there. And happy to have you visit our website as well, or I should say email on the screen or visit our website. So with that, I'll turn it back to Ashley to close us out today.
Thank you. Well, it was rather fitting. I got a couple questions. Will this presentation be shared out? And yes, we'll make it available, both the recording and the slides. So look for that email. And I also would love for you guys to fill out the feedback survey. I put it in the chat there just to take a couple minutes, but we'd love to get your feedback on today's presentation, as well as hear from you what other topics you'd like to hear from us in the future. So with that, I want to thank Paul and Mike for sharing a wealth of information. It was a great presentation today. Thank you, everyone, for taking time out of your day to join us.
Thank you, everyone.
Rest of your day.
Thank you.